When Grandpa's doctor told us he needed a wheelchair after his second stroke, our first concern was how he'd navigate the 3 steps leading to his front door. My brother Marcus and I spent a weekend building a simple wooden ramp. Nothing fancy, just a solid, gently sloping structure that would allow Grandpa to maintain his independence in the home he lived in for over 40 years. We never imagined that 2 days later we'd return to find the ramp completely demolished, splintered pieces of lumber scattered across the lawn like an act of vandalism. But there was nothing random about this destruction. Taped to the Grandpa's front door was an official notice from Pinecrest Estates HOA citing unauthorized architectural modifications and aesthetic code violations. The notice was signed by Elaine Winters, HOA president. "I don't understand," Grandpa said, his voice small as he stared at the debris from his living room window. At 78, Thomas Parker had survived 2 wars, raised 4 children after his wife died young, and beaten cancer twice. But in that moment, looking at the ruins of his access ramp, he seemed suddenly fragile. How am I supposed to get outside now? My blood boiled as I picked up the shattered handrail that Marcus and I had carefully sanded and sealed. "Don't worry, Grandpa. We're going to fix this." "You can't just rebuild it," my sister Rebecca warned, scanning the HOA notice. "It says here any new structures require written approval, and modifications for special needs must adhere to specific design guidelines and use approved materials. There's a whole process." "He's in a wheelchair." I exploded. "This isn't about aesthetics. It's about necessity." "I know that," Rebecca said calmly. As a property lawyer, she was frustratingly rational sometimes. "But if we want to prevent this from happening again, we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." What we were dealing with, as we would soon discover, was Elaine Winters, who had moved to Pinecrest Estates 5 years ago and rapidly ascended to HOA leadership through a combination of ruthless efficiency and the simple fact that most residents were too busy or disinterested to oppose her. Under her presidency, property values had indeed risen, along with fines, compliance requirements, and resident complaints. "She's been on a tear lately about visual harmony," explained our neighbor Mrs. Thornton, who stopped by to express her shock at the ramp's destruction. "Last month she had the Gonzalez family's basketball hoop removed while they were on vacation. Said it was an unsightly recreational installation. Those children had been playing with that hoop for 3 summers. While Rebecca made calls to understand our legal position, I helped Grandpa navigate the temporary solution we created, a metal threshold ramp that barely reached the first step, requiring me to lift the back of his wheelchair while he gripped the door frame. It was precarious and undignified, but at least allowed him to get to his doctor's appointment. "I'm sorry about all this trouble," Grandpa said as I settled him into my car. "Maybe I should just sell the place and move to one of those assisted living facilities." "This is your home," I said firmly. "You're not going anywhere because of some power-hungry HOA president. We're going to make this right." What I didn't tell him was that I'd already decided this wasn't just about rebuilding a ramp. This was about standing up to a bully who had forgotten that rules exist to serve people, not the other way around. As we drove to the doctor's office, I began formulating a plan, one that would require careful research, strategic thinking, and possibly a confrontation I'd been avoiding since moving back to help care for Grandpa. It was time to meet Elaine Winters. The Pinecrest Estates HOA office occupied a small corner of the community clubhouse, a modestly appointed space with beige walls and motivational posters about community excellence. I arrived 10 minutes early for my appointment, but found Elaine Winters already at her desk, a sleek glass and metal affair that seemed out of place among the dated furnishings. At 50-something, Elaine had the polished appearance of someone who considered personal presentation a competitive sport. Her silver blonde bob was immaculately styled, her navy pantsuit wrinkle-free, and her manicure flawless. She looked up from her computer with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Parker, I presume." "Thomas's grandson." "Yes," I replied, extending my hand. "Daniel Parker. Thank you for meeting with me." Her handshake was brief and cool. "Of course, although I must say the tone of your email suggested some dissatisfaction with our community guidelines enforcement." I hope we can have a productive conversation." "That's my hope as well," I said, taking the seat she indicated. "I'd like to understand why my grandfather's wheelchair ramp was demolished without warning or discussion." Elaine's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "The situation is straightforward, Mr. Parker. The structure was built without proper authorization, using non-compliant materials, and violated several sections of our architectural guidelines. Section 7.3 specifically addresses external modifications, including accessibility features." She slid a heavy binder across the desk, open to a page filled with dense text and diagrams. "As you can see, ramps must be constructed of approved materials, specifically composite decking in one of 4 approved colors, and must include decorative elements to maintain aesthetic harmony with the residents. Your construction met none of these criteria." "We didn't know about these requirements," I admitted, "but that doesn't explain why the ramp was demolished rather than a notice being issued first." "A notice was issued," she replied, producing a carbon copy of a form. "This was delivered 3 days before remediation action was taken. I examined the notice, dated the day after we built the ramp. It had been left at Grandpa's house while he was at physical therapy and I was at work. This gives 30 days to address the violation," I pointed out. "You demolished the ramp after just 3 days." For the first time, Elaine looked slightly discomforted. The committee determined that the structure presented a safety hazard requiring immediate action. The materials used were substandard, and the construction appeared unstable. "That's simply untrue," I countered, keeping my voice level with effort. "My brother and I built that ramp according to ADA guidelines. We're both experienced with construction. I'm a civil engineer, and Marcus builds custom furniture for a living. Nevertheless, proper channels weren't followed," she replied, her composure returning. "If your grandfather requires special accommodations, there's a process. The Architectural Review Committee meets monthly to consider such requests." "My grandfather had a stroke," I said. "He needs a wheelchair to leave his house now. He can't wait a month for a committee to decide whether he deserves basic accessibility." Elaine's eyes narrowed slightly. "Everyone in Pennycrest Estates agrees to abide by the same rules when they purchase property here, Mr. Parker. Your grandfather's medical situation, while unfortunate, doesn't exempt him from those obligations." I took a deep breath, reminding myself that losing my temper wouldn't help Grandpa. "Can you tell me exactly what we need to do to get proper approval for a new ramp?" She seemed pleased by my apparent capitulation. "Certainly. You'll need to submit Form AR-17 for architectural modification, along with detailed plans showing materials, dimensions, and aesthetic elements. Include a letter from your grandfather's physician documenting the medical necessity, and a signed affidavit accepting liability for any accidents that might occur on the structure. Once those are received, the committee will review the application at their next meeting on," she consulted a calendar, "May 15th. "That's 3 weeks away," I noted. "My grandfather can't safely enter or exit his home until then. Perhaps he should consider temporary alternative accommodation," she suggested with what I suppose she thought was sympathetic concern. "Many of our residents transition to assisted living when mobility becomes challenging." In that moment, I understood that Elaine Winters didn't see my grandfather as a human being with dignity and rights, but as a property value variable, one that had become inconveniently non-standard. I stood up, gathering my notes. "Thank you for clarifying the process. I'll be in touch." "Mr. Parker," she called as I reached the door, "I hope you understand that our guidelines exist to protect all residents' investments. Personal situations can't take precedence over community standards." I paused, considering my response carefully. "Miss Winters, I understand completely that you believe property values are more important than people. I just disagree." Her face flushed slightly. "That's not what I'll submit the paperwork," I interrupted. "Good day." As I walked to my car, I called my sister. "Rebecca, how quickly can you research the Americans with Disabilities Act as it applies to HOAs? And do you still have that contact at the city building department?" The next 3 days were a whirlwind of research, phone calls, and strategic planning. While Grandpa worried about being a burden, The family mobilized around him. Rebecca's legal background proved invaluable as she dug into federal housing laws and local regulations. Marcus reached out to his network of contractors and builders. I leveraged my engineering connections at the city to understand exactly what permits were required and which ones superseded HOA authority. What we discovered was enlightening. Under the Fair Housing Act and Americans with Disabilities Act, homeowners associations cannot prevent reasonable modifications for disabled residents. While they can establish aesthetic guidelines, they cannot unreasonably delay installation of accessibility features or impose excessive costs that would create an effective barrier. More importantly, we learned that Pinecrest Estates' own bylaws required the HOA to provide written warnings and reasonable time to correct violations before taking action, neither of which had occurred before they demolished Grandpa's ramp. The safety hazard justification was clearly fabricated to circumvent this requirement. Armed with this knowledge, we developed a two-pronged approach, official and grassroots. On the official front, we submitted all required HOA forms for the ramp, while simultaneously applying for a city building permit under accessibility accommodation provisions. On the grassroots side, we began quietly contacting other Pinecrest residents who had experienced similar heavy-handed enforcement from Elaine's administration. "You wouldn't believe how many people have stories," Rebecca reported after an afternoon of phone calls. The Wilson's son wasn't allowed to park his car in their driveway while home from college because it had out-of-state plates. The Chens couldn't put up a temporary sunshade for their daughter's birthday party. And get this, Mrs. Donovan, who's 82, was fined for having wind chimes that weren't on the approved outdoor accessory list. "Are people willing to speak up?" I asked. "Most are afraid of retaliation," Rebecca admitted, but I found 10 homeowners ready to come forward, including 2 former board members who resigned because of Elaine's tactics. Meanwhile, Marcus had connected with a contractor specializing in accessibility modifications, who provided professionally drawn plans for a ramp that would meet both ADA standards and the HOA's aesthetic requirements. The design incorporated the decorative elements Elaine had mentioned, using the approved composite materials and a color-matching Grandpa's house trim. "It'll cost about 3 times what our wooden ramp did," Marcus warned, "but it'll be bulletproof from a compliance standpoint." And I got donations from my supplier. They were pretty outraged when I told them what happened. 5 days after my meeting with Elaine, we received an unexpected visit from Richard Foster, the city's lead building inspector and a former colleague of mine. "Heard you were having some HOA trouble, Dan," he said as we sat on Grandpa's porch. "Your permit application flagged in our system because of the special circumstances code you used." I explained the situation, showing him the demolished ramp remains we preserved as evidence and the new designs we prepared. Richard shook his head in disgust. "Unfortunately, this isn't the first complaint we've had about Pinecrest HOA. There's a fine line between maintaining community standards and abusing authority, and Ms. Winters seems determined to tap dance all over that line." He reviewed our new plans, making a few notations before stamping them with his approval. "This design exceeds both city code and ADA requirements. I'm expediting your permit. You'll have it tomorrow. And Dan," he added, lowering his voice, "you might want to install some security cameras before you rebuild. Just a suggestion." The next day, permit in hand, I called a meeting of everyone who had offered to help. 20 neighbors gathered in Grandpa's living room, along with family members and 3 contractors who had volunteered their services after hearing about the situation. "Here's where we stand," I explained. "We have city approval to build the ramp immediately. According to our lawyer," I nodded toward Rebecca, "the HOA cannot legally prevent accessibility modifications, though they can impose reasonable aesthetic requirements, which our new design satisfies. We've submitted all their required paperwork, but we're not waiting for their monthly meeting to move forward." "What if Elaine tries to stop the construction?" asked Mrs. Thornton. "Or worse, has it torn down again?" "That's where you all come in," I replied. "We're building the ramp this Saturday, starting at 7:00 a.m. We need witnesses present throughout the day, people to document the process, bring refreshments, and simply be visible support. The more community members present, the less likely she'll intervene. And if she does, someone called out. I smiled grimly. Then we have the city permit, federal law, and about a dozen smartphones ready to record whatever happens next. Saturday dawned clear and cool. Perfect building weather. By 6:45 a.m., Grandpa's front yard resembled a construction site crossed with a block party. Marcus and 3 professional contractors had set up workstations on the lawn. Neighbors arrived bearing coffee, donuts, and folding chairs. Mrs. Thornton organized a refreshment table on the driveway, while her teenage grandson helped mount wireless security cameras at strategic points around the property, including one with a clear view of the street and front yard. Grandpa watched from the window, initially embarrassed by all the attention but gradually brightening as he realized this wasn't just about building him a ramp. It was about communities standing together against bullying and discrimination. Work progressed quickly with so many skilled hands. By mid-morning, the foundation was laid and the frame assembled. The composite decking in coastal gray, one of the HOA's approved colors, began to take shape into a gently sloping ramp with a wide turning platform. Decorative post caps and railings matching Grandpa's porch were added, creating a structure that looked like it had always been part of the home's design. It was shortly after noon when a silver Mercedes SUV screeched to a halt at the curb, and Elaine Winters emerged, clutching a leather portfolio and wearing an expression that could curdle milk. She stalked up the driveway, her gaze darting from the half-completed ramp to the crowd of neighbors, clearly taken aback by the scale of the operation. "What is going on here?" she demanded, addressing no one in particular. "This construction has not been approved by the architectural committee." I straightened from where I'd been helping secure a railing post. "Good afternoon, Miss Winters. We're installing an ADA-compliant wheelchair ramp for my grandfather. Would you like to see our city building permit?" "City permit or not, you know perfectly well that all exterior modifications require HOA approval," she snapped. "The committee hasn't even reviewed your application yet." "Actually," Rebecca interjected, stepping forward with a folder, "we've done extensive research on this matter. Under the Fair Housing Act, homeowners associations cannot unreasonably delay accommodations for disabled residents. As my grandfather's medical needs require immediate accessibility modifications, waiting 3 weeks for a committee meeting would constitute such a delay." Elaine's eyes narrowed. "That's a matter of legal interpretation." "Indeed it is," Rebecca agreed pleasantly. "And as an attorney specializing in property law, I'm quite confident in my interpretation. But if you prefer, we can ask the Department of Housing and Urban Development for an official ruling. I have their number right here." A ripple of satisfaction ran through the watching crowd. Elaine sensed her position weakening and changed tactics. "The issue isn't the ramp itself," she insisted, her voice shifting to a more reasonable tone. "It's about following proper procedures. There are aesthetic standards that need to be maintained." "Which we've adhered to meticulously," I interrupted, handing her a copy of our plans. "Composite decking in an approved color, decorative elements matching the existing architecture, professional design and construction. This ramp actually exceeds your guidelines for quality and appearance." Elaine glanced at the plans, clearly searching for a violation and finding none. Her gaze lifted to the gathered neighbors, many of whom were openly recording the interaction on their phones. Something in her expression shifted as she realized this confrontation had an audience extending beyond those physically present. "This is highly irregular," she said stiffly. "The board will need to review this situation." "They're welcome to," I replied. "In the meantime, we have a valid city permit, and we're proceeding with construction. Oh, and Ms. Winters." I pointed discreetly to the security camera mounted under the eaves. "Just so you're aware, the property is now under 24-hour video surveillance. Any attempt to interfere with the ramp will be documented and reported to authorities." For a moment, I thought she might explode from the sheer effort of containing her rage. Instead, she took a deep breath, tucked the plans under her arm, and forced a smile. "I'll be discussing this with our attorney," she said, turning to leave. "Expect further communication." As she stalked back to her Mercedes, Mrs. Thornton called out, "Would you like a donut for the road, Elaine? We have plenty." The burst of laughter that followed seemed to propel Elaine into her car even faster. As she drove away, the atmosphere shifted from tense confrontation back to communal purpose, with everyone returning to their tasks with renewed energy. By sunset, the ramp was complete, a beautiful, sturdy structure that looked like it had been designed with the house rather than added as an afterthought. We gathered for a small ribbon-cutting ceremony, with Grandpa doing the honors from his wheelchair, tears glistening in his eyes as he thanked everyone who had helped. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, he said, his voice wavering slightly. "Today you showed me why I never wanted to live anywhere else." As the neighbors dispersed and darkness fell, I sat with Grandpa on his porch, the new ramp gleaming softly in the security lights we'd installed. "Do you think she'll really call her attorney?" he asked. I shrugged. "She might, but we've done everything legally and properly. More importantly, we've shown that the community doesn't support her tactics. That's a powerful message." "You know," Grandpa mused, "in all my years, I've found that most conflicts aren't really about the thing people are arguing over. They're about feeling heard and respected." He looked out at the ramp thoughtfully. "Maybe Elaine just needs someone to listen to her." I smiled at his characteristic compassion. "Maybe. But first, she needs to stop tearing down other people's ramps." The expected legal threat from the HOA arrived 3 days later, a formally worded letter claiming procedural violations and demanding we submit to the architectural review process retroactively. Rebecca responded with a comprehensive letter citing relevant federal laws, documented evidence of the HOA's improper actions in demolishing the original ramp, and a subtle reminder about the potential for a discrimination lawsuit with accompanying negative publicity. We heard nothing further about the ramp itself, but something more important began happening in Pennycrest Estates. Conversations started at mailboxes, in driveways, at the community pool. People shared their own stories of enforcement overreach and discussed whether the HOA had strayed from its original purpose of maintaining the neighborhood to becoming an entity that prioritized control over community. A private social media group formed where residents could discuss concerns and coordinate responses to unreasonable demands. 3 weeks after the ramp building, the monthly HOA meeting had record attendance. Nearly 60 residents packed the community center meeting room, many standing along the walls when the chairs filled up. Elaine called the meeting to order with visible apprehension, clearly unnerved by the unprecedented turnout. The tension built through routine business items until finally, during the open comment period, Mrs. Donovan, she of the non-approved wind chimes, rose slowly to her feet. "I've lived in Pennycrest for 33 years, she began, her voice quavering slightly. "My husband and I were among the first 10 families to buy homes here. We've seen many changes, mostly for the better, but lately, I don't recognize the community we built. When did we decide that property values matter more than people? When did we agree that uniformity is more important than compassion?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Another elderly resident stood up. "Last summer, my granddaughter couldn't visit for more than 2 weeks because her service dog wasn't on the approved pets list," he said. "A service dog. That's not just mean-spirited. It's illegal." One after another, residents rose to share similar experiences. The Gonzalez family described how their children had cried upon returning from vacation to find their basketball hoop removed. A young couple explained how they'd been fined for having a small vegetable garden in their backyard, hidden from street view, but visible to the HOA president during her property inspections. Throughout these testimonials, Elaine sat rigidly at the board table, occasionally attempting to cut speakers off by citing time limits, but backing down when met with collective resistance. The 3 other board members looked increasingly uncomfortable, especially when former board members described how decision-making power had gradually concentrated in Elaine's hands. Finally, George Peterson, a retired judge and longtime resident, addressed the room. "I move that we form a bylaw review committee to reassess our community guidelines with an emphasis on balancing property maintenance with resident quality of life. I further move that this committee include representatives from different age groups and family situations to ensure diverse perspectives." The motion was quickly seconded and, despite Elaine's procedural objections, passed by an overwhelming show of hands. A follow-up motion to hold a special election for board positions in 60 days also passed, prompting a visible wave of alarm to cross Elaine's face. As the meeting adjourned, I helped Grandpa navigate his wheelchair toward the exit. Elaine intercepted us near the door, her expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Parker," she said, addressing my grandfather directly for the first time, "I want to make it clear that the board never intended to limit your independence. Our concerns were purely about process and safety." Grandpa looked at her thoughtfully. "You know, Ms. Winters, my late wife used to say that intentions matter less than impact. You might not have intended to leave me housebound, but that was the impact of your actions." She seemed taken aback by his directness. "The regulations exist for everyone's benefit." "Rules should serve people, not the other way around," Grandpa interrupted gently. "When they stop serving people, they should be changed." 2 months later, Pinecrest Estates held its special election. Elaine Winters did not run for re-election as president, though rumors suggested this decision came after learning about the large number of candidates running specifically on platforms opposing her leadership style. The new board, including Mrs. Thornton and Judge Peterson, immediately began implementing reforms to the enforcement process, including mandatory mediation before penalties and special provisions for hardship and accessibility needs. The Bylaw Review Committee, which included my sister Rebecca, worked through the dense regulations, identifying and modifying rules that served no practical purpose beyond aesthetic control. While core standards protecting property values remained, the emphasis shifted from punitive enforcement to community support. As for Grandpa's ramp, it became something of a model for accessibility modifications in the neighborhood. 2 other residents with mobility challenges requested similar structures, and the new board expedited their approval. The ramp builder Marcus had brought in even created a standardized design package that met both HOA aesthetic requirements and ADA standards, offering it at a discount to Pinecrest residents. Elaine Winters didn't leave the community as some had speculated she might. Instead, she gradually adapted to the new reality, eventually joining the landscaping committee, where her attention to detail proved valuable without being oppressive. I sometimes saw her in the neighborhood during visits to Grandpa, and she would nod politely before continuing on her way. 1 year after our ramp confrontation, Grandpa hosted a neighborhood barbecue in his backyard, accessible via a gate at the end of his newly installed ramp. Nearly 40 neighbors attended, including several board members and, surprisingly, Elaine Winters, who arrived with a store-bought pie and an awkward smile. "Your grandfather invited me," she explained when I greeted her with poorly concealed surprise. "He's been helping me with my garden. Apparently I've been doing everything wrong with my roses." I watched as she made her way to where Grandpa sat holding court by the grill, offering gardening advice and neighborhood stories to a rapt audience. They spoke briefly, her posture gradually relaxing as their conversation continued. "Would you look at that?" Rebecca murmured, joining me with a cold drink. "Grandpa's making friends with the enemy." I shook my head. "He doesn't see enemies, just people who haven't found the right path yet." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, I found myself reflecting on the journey of the past year. What had begun as a simple need for accessibility had transformed an entire community's understanding of what truly makes a neighborhood valuable. It wasn't uniform mailboxes or approved paint colors that created community. It was compassion, respect for diversity, and standing together when it mattered. And sometimes, all of that starts with a single ramp.